Today we begin the fifth and the last book of Torah. That's the book of Devarim, which means in itself words. It begins by saying, these are the words that Moshe spoke to all Israel on the far side of the Yarden River. It was 11 days' journey from Horev to Kadesh Barnea by the way of Mount Seir. On the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year, Moshe spoke to the people of Israel, reviewing everything that Yahweh had ordered him to tell them. Now that 11-day journey took actually 38 years, because all that first generation who had continued to hold Yahweh in contempt rather than showing him respect, all died in the wilderness. When Israel first arrived at Mount Horev, they said to Moshe, everything that Yahweh tells us, we will do. So it was effectively like a marriage vow from the bride to the groom. Yet as soon as Yahweh had given the 10 words of Torah, they became frightened and said, you, Moshe, speak to us and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us or we will die. While Moshe spent another 40 days on the top of the mountain, people began to build the golden calf and turned their backs on all that they had promised to do. That was bad enough. But then they also listened to the 10 reports from the spies who reconnoitred the land. In response, Yahweh instructed that they would all die in the wilderness. Only those who were 20 years and younger would survive that 38 years of wandering. The young ones, along with Moshe, Yehoshua, Eleazar, the son of Aaron, and Caleb, survived that 38 years. The marriage between Yahweh and Israel had ended almost before it began. Yet even those who were 20 years and younger still did not appreciate the gravity of what had happened to their parents during that period of wandering. By the time those individuals had reached the plains of Moab, they had become the clan chiefs and the leaders of the people of Israel. They were the ones who had been teenagers at Mount Horev, but now they are actually 50 to 60 years old. They were the ones who were responsible for the future of that second generation who were camped on the plains of Moab in preparation for their entry into the land that Yahweh had promised to Abraham. However, those clan chiefs, who were now the leaders, were all put to death on the instruction of Yahweh because they had failed to stop their sons from whoring with the Midianite women. In fact, one of their number, who had escaped the hanging, charged through the assembly right there in front of the Mishkan and took a Midianite princess into his family's tent in a lustful frenzy. And that is why Yahweh had to purge the whole community of Israel before they crossed the Yarden to take possession of the promised land. The whole of that second generation needed to be instructed in the ways of Yahweh, because none of them had adhered to what Yahweh had shown throughout the time in the wilderness. Many of them did not listen to what their parents had said when they were told about what had happened in Egypt before they departed. Any oral information that should have been passed on to that second generation had obviously been lost by the depression and futility that engulfed their parents. So the 2 tablets of stone that had been given as a marriage ketubah to that first generation were now locked away inside the Ark of the Covenant. Those tablets were never seen by that second generation or the ones that followed. Now what about the book of Devarim itself? Moshe had to begin all over again to teach that second generation all that Yahweh had given him at Mount Horev. All the instructions previously given had to be taught to this second generation. That is why many of the words of book of Devarim are a repeat of what Moshe had said and been given at Mount Horev. However, there are subtle differences which show that the new instructions that were being given were for a different purpose. Where the Torah given at Mount Horev had formed the basis of a marriage covenant between Yahweh and his people Israel, this second expression of Torah was couching the message in the language of a king, making a covenant with his subjects. It has been suggested by a number of modern scholars that the book of Devarim is actually structured like a treaty document made between a king and a vassal nation that he's just conquered. It was never intended to be a ketubah like the one at Mount Horev. So let's look briefly at the structure of Devarim. The whole book is set out like a treaty document, which was arranged in accordance with the ancient Near Eastern practice of that period. When a king conquered a neighboring nation, he would establish a treaty which prescribed the conditions that were required by that vassal nation. The content of a typical treaty document comprised 6 specific parts. 1, the Preamble. 2, the historical review of all that had previously transpired. 3 is the stipulations of the king's requirements for that vassal nation. 4 is the terms and conditions on which the stipulations were to be met. And then 5, blessings and curses that were relating to the terms of compliance. And finally, of course, it calls for witnesses to the making of the treaty. Now, as we go through the book of Devarim, we will see various parts of this treaty structure unfolding as we see it over the next few weeks. But for now, let's consider just the very important points as a summary. The Preamble sets down the following details. It gives the location, which was the plains of Moab. The time is the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year after the Exodus. The authority who's writing the treaty or making the treaty is Moshe, acting on behalf of Yahweh as the king. And the vassal recipients are that second generation of Israel. Now we look at the historical review. Moshe recaps the history that brought them to where they were and recalls many events and places which they visited in Numbers chapter 33, where the whole of the first generation had sojourned over 38 years. Then we have specific stipulations. The 10 words, with subtle changes, reflect how it's being given to a different audience from the initial one. Then comes the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the instructions that were to be obeyed. He reviews many of the events surrounding the marriage at Mount Horev. It's now couched in the language of a king and his subjects. Then we have the general stipulations, where he reiterates many of the mitzvot given by Yahweh at Mount Horev, with special reference to how the second generation were to follow and apply all the commands of Torah while they dwelt in the land of promise. Next we come to the terms and conditions. In Devarim chapter 11 verse 29, it says, when Yahweh your God brings you into the land you are entering in order to possess it, you are to put a blessing on Mount Gerizim and a curse on Mount Ebal. And the next term and condition, or next condition, was Devarim 31 verse 10 to 11. Moshe gave them these orders. At the end of every 7 years, during the festival of Sukkot, in the year of Shemitah, when Israel have come to appear in the presence of Yahweh at the place that he will choose, you are to read this Torah before all Israel, so that they can all hear it. Then, of course, come the blessings and the curses. In chapter 28, he lists out the blessings and follows them with the curses that relate to the intent of the treaty document and how they will be enforced. Chapters 29 and 30 spell out the actual consequences if the people broke the covenant and how the curses would be progressively enforced, with ever-increasing severity if Israel refused to turn back to Yahweh. Finally, the blessings that would be reinstated if they did teshuvah, or returned to Yahweh, along with the promise that they would live long in the land. Then, of course, it had to be signed and witnessed. The Moshe called upon heaven and earth as his witnesses. And finally, Moshe taught them all the Song of Moshe, which is in chapter 32, verses 1 to 52. The book of Devarim is all about the outworkings of what was previously recorded in the 4 books of Moshe. However, the scroll that contained the Torah was only available at the Mishkan. Therefore, it was necessary for all of Israel to assemble in the place that Yahweh chose every 7 years at Sukkot. During that appointed gathering, each person in that generation and every subsequent generation would hear for themselves all the words of Torah. It was to be a constant reminder about their relationship with Yahweh and what it really meant. So let's move on and see why Devarim is different from the previous 4 books. The book of Devarim, as I said before, opens with these words. These are the words Moshe spoke to all Israel. Those words are important because throughout the book of Devarim, Moshe speaks directly, but Yahweh is completely silent. That is a complete opposite from what we find in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. In each of those 3 books, nearly all the instructions are prefaced by the phrase, Yahweh said to Moshe. Each time Yahweh spoke to Moshe, then Moshe spoke to Israel. So why did Yahweh not speak directly to Israel when he was giving the Torah? After all, he had spoken to them when he gave the 10 words from the top of Mount Horev. Maybe it was because of that event. Because in Exodus chapter 20, verse 16, you, Moshe, speak with us and we will listen. But don't let God speak to us or we will die. From that point forward, from the giving of those 10 words, Yahweh heeded the words of Israel. And all the way through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, Yahweh only ever spoke to Israel through Moshe, just as Israel had requested. They didn't want to hear directly from Yahweh, only through Moshe. But in Devarim, it is Moshe who establishes that treaty with the 2nd generation. Because just like their fathers before them, they did not deserve to hear what Yahweh had to say directly. Throughout the book of Devarim, Yahweh remains completely silent. The phrase, Yahweh said to Moshe, only appears 3 times in Devarim. And each time it is dealing directly with Moshe on personal matters relating to his pending death. That is a stark contrast from the 3 books where the phrase Yahweh said to Moshe appears in Exodus 49 times, in Leviticus 33 times, and Numbers 54 times. These were not new covenants. These were not new mitzvot that Yahweh was giving. These were a repeat of what had been given at Mount Horev. But of course the circumstances were different. It was no longer a marriage. It was now a covenant between a king and his subjects. There was a reiteration of many of the words that had been spoken at Mount Horev. However, the way those words were presented was different. It wasn't a marriage contract, but rather a king setting out the conditions for his vassal nation. And Moshe was acting as the king's agent. He was vested with the responsibility of making that treaty on behalf of his master, the king, Yahweh. Tragically, the original marriage covenant at Mount Horev had been reduced to a treaty between a king and his subjects. The relationship was no longer the way Yahweh had originally intended it to be. That is why Moshe tells the people in chapter 12, verse 32, "Everything I am commanding you, you are to take care to do. Do not add to it, and do not subtract from it." Devarim was the last direct instruction from Moshe as given by Yahweh for the people of Israel before they crossed the Yarden River, and of course before Moshe died. Never again did Yahweh speak directly with Israel through a person like Moshe. Once Moshe died on the plains of Moab, the direct presentation of Torah ceased. Throughout the time Israel spent in the land, as Yahweh had promised, they received instructions through the prophets, but indirectly, as an ongoing reminder of if they failed to follow the words of Moshe, they would pay a very dear price, and finally, of course, be ejected from the land. So what about those prophetic messages? All the messages that Yahweh passed on to his people while they dwelt in the land of promise were given through dreams and visions, given to selected prophets. The early prophets were from Yehoshua through to 2 Kings. The latter prophets were from Isaiah to Malachi. The early writings, lasted from Psalms right through to 2 Chronicles. And finally, the latter writings were given in the form of the Brit Hadashah from Matthew right through to Revelation. None of them added to or subtracted from the words of Torah that had been given to Moshe at Mount Horev. That is why it is important, when reading the scriptures, that we consider them in terms of the Torah of Moshe. We must always read everything in Scripture, whether it's the prophets or the Brit Hadashah, in conjunction with the context of Torah. As we have been taught through the words of Shaul, every word of Torah, of course, pointed forward to Yeshua. That is why Yeshua himself was able to say in John chapter 5, verses 46-47, "If you really believed Moshe, you would believe me, because it was about me that he wrote. But if you don't believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say?" Those are powerful words that we and all should reflect upon carefully, because the words of Torah can never be replaced by any man-made doctrines. Let's move on now to Isaiah chapter 1. In that chapter, we see the outworking of all Moshe had said to that second generation. This time, Yahweh is using Isaiah to rebuke his generation of Yehudah. By that time, the 10 tribes had been taken away into exile by Assyria. When Isaiah spoke to the people, they had been in Eretz Israel for 866 years. And by that stage, the only 2 tribes remained. All the curses Moshe had laid before the second generation on the plains of Moab were beginning to be brought to bear. Isaiah, in the opening words of his vision, tells Yehuda and Jerusalem that time is rapidly running out for them. Because Yehuda, just like Israel, had failed to follow the words of Yahweh, they were soon to be taken out of the land by force into exile in Babylon. However, in verses 18 through 20, Isaiah gives a brief glimmer of the hope to Yehuda by telling them of the blessings that Yahweh is still prepared to bestow upon them if they will just turn back and repent, and once again follow the words of Yahweh. However, even with those words ringing in their ears, they still refused to listen and paid the price. As we read in verse 20, "If you refuse and rebel, you will be eaten by the sword." Finally, they were eaten by the sword of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. So let's look at Yeshua and the Second Temple period. After they'd been eaten by Nebuchadnezzar's sword, they spent 70 years in exile. Yahweh allowed Yehuda, however, to return to Eretz Israel. But even they did not deserve to be there. However, as part of God's sovereign plan, Yahweh did indeed return them, so that the prophecy that had been given by Yaakov, the 3rd patriarch, would be fulfilled. That is, the birth of Yeshua, because he had to be born through the tribe of Yehuda in the land of Israel. Yeshua was born at the climax of history. His birth was timed to show the world that Herod the Great, who claimed to be king of the Jews, was an Edomite, an impostor, and that his dynasty would soon come to an end. That in itself is very significant because Herod was the only Goy or Gentile who claimed kingship of Israel while living in the land. All the foreign folk, Herod, and all the rulers after him had lived beyond the borders of the land of promise. He was the only one who claimed to be king over the Jews in the land. That is why Yeshua had to be born before he died, to show who truly was the king of Israel. So having established who the true king was, Yeshua had to wait until the time was right to make his identity known to both the people of Yehuda and the Roman world. It was not until 30 years later that Yeshua set out on his earthly ministry, which of course challenged the people of his generation, just as Moshe, Isaiah, and all the other prophets had all challenged their own generations. Now it's Yeshua's turn to challenge his generation. Then, 40 years after his death and resurrection, the Messianic window closed, and the Second Temple was also destroyed, with the greater part of Yehuda once again thrust out into what became a prolonged exile. There was a sense of déjà vu for the people of Yehuda, because they were forced out into the Hellenistic Greco-Roman diaspora, where the lifestyle was very similar to what they had sought to emulate during the period leading up to the desecration of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes. It's amazing how history repeats itself. Now let's return to the returning of Yeshua. As we read in Yochanan chapter 14, Yeshua not only challenged his generation, but as we read from the words of that chapter, he also gathered around him 12 men who became the foundation stones of the Messianic community of the first century. Then, following the destruction of the Second Temple, there was a long hiatus when the Messianic community was nearly extinguished. However, now in the 21st century, that same Messianic community is coming to life. And we are part of that generation which is seeing the renewal of the Messianic community. Just as Yeshua encouraged his Talmudim in Yochanan chapter 14, we can also take courage from those words as we await his return. So what about the future outcome? Just as Moshe warned the second generation of Israel what was expected of them, so also Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all the other prophets warned their respective generations of the blessings and curses that Moshe had put in place before them. Each subsequent generation had to face the same challenges, including the generation who lived at the time of Yeshua's earthly ministry. In each generation, the majority failed. So the question must be asked, what will become of all those generations of Israel who have been challenged by Yahweh in various ways? What will happen to all of those who turned away from Yahweh and ended up enduring the curses that were documented by Moshe? Will they be cut off from Israel forever? As we saw in Devarim chapter 1, what Moshe laid before Israel was meant for every generation. Each one had to make a choice of its own. Because Yahweh was silent when Moshe laid down the blessings and curses, it meant that through the work of Yeshua's death, resurrection, all Israel can be restored. That is why we read Ezekiel Chapter 37. Because there we see how Ezekiel was taken to the valley full of dry bones. Then verse 3, Yahweh asks, "Human being, can these bones live?" I answered, "Yahweh Elohim, only you know that." Then in verse 12, Yahweh gave his answer, saying, "My people, I will open your graves and make you get out of your graves, and I will bring you into the land of Israel." Now Yeshua alone is the one who is capable of opening those graves and bringing those people back to life. And he gave us two big examples of that power. Firstly, with the resurrection of Lazarus in Yochanan or John chapter 12. Then at the time of his death in Matthew chapter 27, 52, the graves were opened and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. So in conclusion, Yahweh has never abandoned his people. He has always disciplined them in many different ways. But through Yeshua, all will be resurrected. And as Ezekiel 37:14 says, "I will put my spirit in you, and you will live. Then I will place you in your own land, and you will know that I, Yahweh, have spoken, and that I have done it," says Yahweh. So what Moshe laid before that second generation of Israel has been a constant reminder that Yahweh is in control of the destiny of not only Israel, but the whole of mankind. And he will resurrect all mankind during the reign of Yeshua, so that the sovereign plan of God can be brought to completion in the way that it was always intended. Shabbat Shalom.